One of the primary benefits would be, especially for young families where children are part of the household, is that working from home provides flexibility, especially in an era where childcare can be extremely expensive. So from that perspective, it gives an opportunity perhaps to make more than just a subsistence living while trying to grow your family.
So I can tell you from personal experience that working from home is a blessing for people who are unable to make it to the physical workspace because of health reasons, or find it very uncomfortable to work in a physical workplace because of discrimination or other kind of biases in the organization. So yeah, my own medical reasons made me work from home for 3 years. It was great to be earning from home, and that's something that I hope will continue going forward.
Dan, I think we can also say that during the pandemic, working from home has reduced some levels of anxiety and fear. Think about worrying about using public transport, about COVID protocols being maintained by people, worry about who's been vaccinated, who might be a super spreader. And so there are some anxieties could be alleviated, but bearing in mind that in other respects, the amount of juggling of work and home has changed somewhat. So, for example, if schools are shut, there's been homeschooling to be undertaken.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, I guess this draws on some of the well-known benefits of home working as well. So so remote working offers benefits in terms of being able to avoid the time and financial cost of the commute. It allows people to better manage the schedule of work activities, combining work with the rest of their lives. So there's those kind of benefits that are long-standing acknowledged benefits from remote working that have still applied in these cases. But obviously, some of the things you've mentioned there, offer us that kind of different context to what we've seen in the last year.
Yes, I guess because our chapter was focused around job design, we thought that the main things and some of the research was coming out at the time was around the fact that people could, in theory, bring their work-life balance back into norm. And we're finding that now, particularly here in Australia, as we're coming out of the pandemic, people are basically saying, I want to stay in a hybrid type of work scenario. So that would be the main benefit that was perceived. However, during the pandemic, we saw a lot of people, particularly women, had far more pressure put on them because they were obviously at home, but also they were primary school givers as well, if they had people, their children at home. So there's a catch-22 there. People perceive more work-life balance, but in the intensity of the pandemic, they basically found that they were doing far more work than they normally would have done. But post-pandemic, we're seeing that definitely people have said, I really like this work-life balance and the hybrid control that the job gives me.
I would highlight for the case of big cities, people living in big cities, the commuting. So the not commuting to work is another main benefit of remote working at this time.
That time and financial cost associated with commuting and being able to avoid that.
The COVID-19 pandemic has forced many organizations to introduce remote working and allow their employee to work remotely and thus at a distance from the organization and from colleagues. Many of these organizations, public and private organizations, have decided to confirm this new way of working also after the epidemiological emergency. In this regard, with my colleague Luisa Enrichiello, we in our chapter we have underlined the importance to adopt supportive structure, system and practices for the effective implementation of remote working in the post-COVID era. what does it mean, organizational support? Organizational support is a multi-dimensional construct that encompasses organizational support, so at organizational level, supervisor support, employee support, and thus support from colleague, and finally, technological related support. As for organizational support, it refers to the extent to which the organization demonstrates to its employee that they are taking care of remote workers. This organizational support has been demonstrated to be even more important in a virtual environment or in a hybrid work, and with a positive effect on remote workers' job satisfaction, on their it enables to reduce the psychological strain, the fear of being abandoned by the organization when at a distance, and organizational support, a supportive structure and system, also enables to reduce the professional isolation, which means the fear to have less opportunities, professional opportunities, from colleagues working in the office. And organizational support, it comprehends norms and procedures, so the identification of norms and procedures in order that people feel to be treated equally, but it also includes the identification of a system for the evaluation of employee, their performance as well as reward system, but also the identification of a career development plan along with training development plan. As for supervisor support, it is really important in remote working, where supervisors have to play a key role because they have to help employee, first of all, to learn how to manage the overlap between the professional and personal roles. So the supervisors have to behave as coach and help people to be able to work effectively in a virtual environment and work individually, but also collaborate with colleagues. So from one end, supervisor act as coach. From the other end, supervisor have to be able to adopt a direction-giving language, which means that they have to provide people with all information about objective and activities and available resources to achieve those objectives. So we have organizational support is important, supervisor support, being supported, perceived to be supported by supervisor, has been demonstrating to be very important in remote working. Even if at a lesser extent, it is very important also that remote workers perceive to be supported by their colleague, So we are referring to an horizontal level in order that they feel to be socially integrated with other members, and in order that they feel to be central, to be valued, to be respected by the organization. Finally, another relevant point relates to technological support, and technological support in remote working arrangement refers to both technology for working purposes, but also for technological tools and systems enabling people to interact, collaborate and communicate even when they are at distance. So we have two typology of technological tools and system, work related and relational related, and where it will be always more important that not only people, remote workers, are provided with all tools for effectively work individually or in group, but it is also very important that organization help people to learn the way they can effectively use this technological tool.
I am somebody who has worked from home for many, many years. And the key reason for that was becoming a solo parent and wanting to be based near to the children's nursery and then school to be able to respond to any emergencies, but also where possible to be present at pick up and drop off. Working from home, therefore, afforded me not a perfect, but certainly a better work-life balance, and being able to balance the multiple demands that I think are placed on parents, but specifically independent parents. Of course, I do recognise that I was in a privileged position when the pandemic hit, of having my own small home office and a quiet space from which to work, which I would often use to get away from some of the distractions that one finds in physical offices.
Technology is transversal to all dimensions of support. So, for example, e-learning activities are enabled by an integrated technology platform, including the company intranet, web-based application, multimedia content, and collaborative tools. Also, training goes as in hand with the state-of-art technological infrastructures, including online simulators, living classrooms, interactive presentations, and application sharing. Moreover, a portfolio of technology solutions supports social networking, both internally and across organizational boundaries.
I would say there are a few different challenges. One of the primary challenges is something that was already alluded to, which is childcare in the home for educational purposes or even just childcare. I think from an economic perspective opens up this door of starting to think of the child from the sense of actually creating a human being. I think a lot of parents perhaps created a child because they thought it was the process of the progress of life, not completely understanding the relationship between parent and child. And this is a really important point, I think, that needs to be brought up and talked about a lot more, because it deals with a lot of social issues that we have when these children reach adulthood. If having a child is completely reliant on external factors and not necessarily the interaction between parent and child, then we have a fundamental problem in our society. So I think that's one area that actually started to surface. And even homeschooling children of parents who have means definitely widened that divide between those children who have parents who do not have needs. So school closures only exacerbated pre-existing inequities as a result. But there's one aspect to all of this that I also think is really important to surface, which is the false perception that somehow working from home is less resource intensive or more sustainable. It is more sustainable perhaps when we think of carbon emissions from an automobile. When we think even right now as we're sitting in our different locations using video streaming, that's highly energy intensive. So there's so much more to the costs that are unseen by using technology that I think need to be brought to the forefront to look at it from a more efficient perspective.
Yeah, so see, this pandemic was a forced situation, but to continue in a work from home position as a permanent way of working, as some companies are thinking of putting an entire section of their employees under work from home. You know, those with more transactional kind of jobs, they can do it from home or something. So in that case, one of the things that we and my co-author looked into was the challenges to their career advancement. Yeah. So is the IT infrastructure good enough for them to work from home? Like in a country like India, internet and power connectivity is a big issue. Yeah, and similarly, you know, when you're working from home, are you able to learn and get access to as much challenging work as, you know, variety of work and tasks as you did when you worked at office? Because we know a lot of learning is informal learning. You know, somebody just gives you a good tip or something like that when you're working side by side. Where does that go when you're working remotely? And finally, this visibility question is a big thing. Like anecdotally, also when I was speaking to some people, it was like, if they don't see me, will they know that I made this contribution? You know, somebody may take away my credit, then what? So that visibility issue continues, especially because although we may have moved to remote working, our way of evaluating people perhaps has not caught up. You know, we are still looking at FaceTime. Hey, I can't see that person working, so maybe that person is shirking and, you know, doing online shopping. So some things have moved ahead, but something still needs to catch up. So that's a big challenge yet.
3 points just to elaborate on things already mentioned. Picking up the cost theme, some of the costs of undertaking work have been offloaded to the home, haven't they? And not everybody has got the space within the home to set up a home office. So there's the space and cost, and then the social aspect, the social interaction, especially if someone lives alone. Social interaction in the workplace is an important aspect of everyday life for well-being, etc. So social interaction is very different in a spatially and cyberspace world, and forging social networks. And I think a number of people have been recruited during the pandemic and never actually seen their office. I've got a colleague who works for me and she's never actually visited our place of work. It's amazing to think that, isn't it?
That notion of impact on relationships is really, really interesting to consider. The idea that our professional and social networks can be more challenging to maintain and develop. Indeed, when people join a workplace, they instead of being, you know, getting to meet people on their first day, being shown around the workplace location and interacting with not only people they have to work with day to day, but other people within the organization, that may be missed, and that loss of that contact and that more extended professional networks are a really interesting dimension. And as Irene already mentioned, the social side of this as well, the social relationships that may be missed or may be more difficult to maintain for individuals.
We're actually commoditizing our labor force, and the commoditization of that labor force is just yet another differentiation of hierarchy, except now we might be doing over geographical levels. And that means that certain individuals will not have the ability for the social interaction, as you've noted, the movement, the upward mobility in their positions. And I would imagine that's only going to create a greater amount of social divide, because we are social creatures at the end of the day. One other aspect that was brought up was this idea fundamentally related to trust. So the fact that we feel uncomfortable having to leave our homes means already that there's a sense of societal trust being broken down. And societal trust is really important for the well-development of any kind of society as we move forward. So how do you establish that trust if you never really physically interact?
There is one other point related to social interactions that I wanted to add. It's often been noted, especially for women, if there's a lot of work-family conflict at their homes or just family conflicts, for a lot of women, their workplace friends are some kind of a security network. They'll tell you resources or they'll give you tips on how to handle things because they have done it so themselves. And it's often thought that if women are now further restricted to home, they're allowed to work, but they're still in that four walls of the house. So are they really free now? So they may be financially independent, but once again, the women are restricted to the four walls of the house, and they are prevented from accessing their external networks who may have been their, help networks. So that's another aspect of working from home.
Dan, I'll just pick up the gender theme again. There's been some interesting work looking at what's happened to work-life balance from a gender perspective in the UK during the pandemic. And it won't surprise any of us to discover that the bulk of the home work has been shouldered by women partners. So with the homeschooling, etc. So there might be, in some respects, a decline in gender equity brought about because of the way that we're working during the pandemic.
One of the things we picked up was probably an ongoing theme that I think we identified, that a lot of employers were trying to maintain 19th and 20th century work cultures in a 21st century virtual environment. So we started to identify a lot of employers trying to put surveillance, electronic surveillance material onto their employees' machines, whether it be their telephones or their computers, because they weren't physically there. A lot of them felt they couldn't trust their employees. So what's the best way to actually surveil them is to electronically surveil them. And the danger with that is we got a lot of people who felt stressed because of it all, because some of the quotes we picked up on were, if I'm away from my camera for 10 seconds, I get an email saying, where are you? If I leave for a minute, I'm logged out and I have to come back in. Now, this speaks to sort of Taylorism of 100 years ago, as opposed to 21st century work practices. So I think that while a lot of people saw the opportunity for control, I think trust in the relationship is still a problem in that respect.
Well, in our chapter, we analyze remote working from a gender perspective under COVID-19, so it's a specific situation. And we analyze how individuals who work remotely and those who did not work remotely coped with the increase in domestic and care work during this period due to the closing of schools, daycare centers, and people just spending more time at home. We find that the pandemic increased both domestic and care activities, with the former being more frequent for women and those under remote work. In general, this was not accompanied by a better division of these activities across sexes, as women remain the main responsible for these activities. But some improvements, they were also found in our chapter, and they were most observed amongst those under remote work, so doing remote work. But this is not enough to counterbalance the overall increase of unpaid work related to remote work when this improvement in its division does not occur. So one of the main challenges in our view from the chapter is how remote work impacts domestic and care work and how this is divided in terms of gender.
Can I also add to that, and it's probably a similar thing to that discussion, is that also as well, we found that people found it difficult to switch off from work when they're working at home. They basically, my bedroom is next door, my kids are downstairs watching the telly. It's difficult to know where your start and stop was. And I think while you picked up on the fact that we got rid of commuting was often that buffer between going to work and coming home from work. And, literally people fall out of bed now and start work, or their employer's not going to encourage them to stop working. So people find that difficulty as well of balancing that work intensification particularly if they're being surveilled all the time. So I think there's a lot of dark issues that are going to continue to come out of this hybrid relationship post-COVID.
My time working from home, which would probably be about 2/3 of the week previously, was all about getting my head down away from distraction. What the pandemic context has led to is a proliferation of online meetings always being on, and an intrusion into one's home life through these technologies. And I think that has been difficult and has been a challenge, and runs the very real risk of working excessive hours for a sustained period during this lockdown. And as we begin to come out of it, what will that look like in terms of the detrimental effect on our physical and mental health of continually being on? Because naturally human beings require rest and respite, and this is something that has fallen by the wayside during lockdown, particularly again for those of us with caring responsibilities. And the rate of output that's driven in part by online technologies and always being on is not sustainable in the long run. So my concern is that one of the challenges faced by employers and employees around remote working is how can individuals and teams be encouraged to switch off, to have that downtime, to have that time away from the screens, and time whereby we actively delineate our home and working lives, even if our working lives have proliferated within our home sphere. And it's no easy feat.
The first is that notwithstanding the importance of ICT tools, there are also some potential risks associated with too much emphasis on a remote culture imbued with technology. So, for example, online access to a huge amount of information and the availability of several options concerning learning programs and social networking tools could generate the feelings of being overwhelmed by an excessive volume of information and options. This could make it difficult for employees to take decisions and also can generate high pressure for individual proactive behavior. The second aspect to consider is that too much emphasis on full remote or rework could lead companies to undervalue organizational support in the so-called hybrid work environments, where there is the coexistence of remote and office-based activities. In this respect, empirical findings show the value attached by remote workers to physical interaction with managers and colleagues. Finally, findings highlight the importance of physical organizational spaces. The chance to work at the office, indeed, is viewed by our informants as a key resource to avoid professional isolation by maintaining informal relationships and exchanging knowledge with peers. This points at the importance that designers and managers pay attention to avoid that offices become mere logistical support for workers. These, in fact, risk to be deprived of an institutional workplace. At the same time, they should ensure that work environments meet the needs of employees, whether they work locally or remotely.
To some extent, this ties directly to what has already been noted, in the sense that it'll probably be applied to differentiate the labor force. Some people who already are in higher status positions will be able to enjoy it for the greater flexibility it provides them, but they still have the in-person interaction. I fundamentally believe, though, that we need to promote trust in this post-COVID labor force to really develop that social cohesion that we need for the next pandemic or global issue that's going to come, which is very highly predicted to come.
From what we are getting from talking to different organizations in India, at least, is so there are two types of organizations. Some organizations have decided that work from home is just not going to work for us. The minute things are okay, everybody's coming on board. Then there are a bunch of folks who've said that, hey, we never had work from home before, but we find that aspects of it work. And now they are going to trifurcate their workforce. Yeah, so there'll be some functions that will be placed permanently under work from home, some functions that will not work from home definitely, maybe one odd when you're not feeling well or something, but they definitely have to be on the shop floor. And then there is another set, which is usually the white-collared workers who can work for maybe 2-3 days in a week from home, then come just for a meeting, share ideas, maybe, share their ideas with the blue-collared staff, which definitely cannot work from home because they're working with machines, etc. So there is a kind of trifurcation of a workforce that is expected. And then, of course, like I said, some organizations will simply not work from home at all.
Yeah, so I think that the debates to some degree are centering on a combination of work operating within a workplace, returning to a workplace, work that's going to take a more hybrid form, combining time spent in a co-located employer workplace with time spent at home or indeed in other locations, and then of course the group that may be moved to or remain in exclusive or permanent home working. So there's likely to be that structure of a mix of those different types of work location being adopted.
For those people that were instructed to work from home and are still working from home, that some are really looking forward to going back to the office, but perhaps in a blended way. And obviously UK is a very small geographical country, but what's been fascinating is how property searches and house relocations, the property market's really buoyant at the moment in UK. And there's been a mini flight from some urban areas to more rural areas. And this is picking up the idea that we've got more flexibility where we work. And there's this fear of the spread of COVID in more densely populated urban areas. So, for example, we've seen the price of rentals for apartments in London fall. And then smaller urban areas, small towns in rural areas, the property market's very buoyant, and people looking for houses with gardens and access to green space. So something's happening, but that can happen in a densely populated small country like UK, and not possibly everywhere.
Yeah, and I think just building on a number of the things we've already spoken about, there's definitely this notion that not everyone can or wants to work at home. So that there's a, as we're all aware, there's a number of benefits to be had from working from home, and these are well documented, long-standing benefits as well as benefits that have been more emerging in the last year. But at the same time, there's this definite acknowledgement that not everyone can work at home because of their own personal situation, the nature of their job, or other factors, and that equally there will be some people who don't want to work from home.
Well, what Irene brought up with regard to what's happening in the UK is happening in the US, of course, as well. We've seen a tremendous amount of movement in terms of purchasing, but part of that's also fueled by lower interest rates. Our interest rate environment is one that has kept the prices, the cost of borrowing quite low, which of course leads to the increase in the price automatically because people are starting to buy up based on their perceived ability to afford. The question as to whether or not that's related to a permanent shift in the employment market remains unknown. It could also be more than fear-based with regard to COVID and being in urban areas. It could also be a quality of life desire, that COVID actually awakened for a large number of people the balance of life that they could have that they did not partake in before. So it's very difficult to tell at this point. There's so many factors, the interest rate factors, COVID factors, the desire for a better quality of life factors, the work-life balance factor. So I would say that's a very challenging question to answer.
I think it's going to be a hybrid version of work. If we look at Australia, as we're sort of very interestingly a comparison with Britain, where you've been hit by COVID and we haven't, but you've rolled out the vaccine, but we're having a really bad time with it, rolling it out. Companies and organisations are trying to get people to come back to work, and they're trying to mandate people to return to the CBDs. Here in Melbourne, it's a ghost town, and people are saying, well, no, I want a hybrid. I want to be able to meet with my colleagues and friends, and work colleagues maybe a couple of days a week. But at the other extreme, I want to be able to work as much as I want to at home as well. So I think that's one of the key factors we'll see, that people will basically say, oh, I don't want to go back to commuting like I used to. And I think employers are going to have to accept that. I understand, I don't know whether this is true, Dan, is that Boris Johnson was pushing for legislation almost to allow people to work at home, but that sort of got distracted and watered down by the big companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's been a discussion about the concept of a right to work from home, just as a right to work flexibly, a kind of legal right to work from home, and request that as part of a kind of employment relationship. But there's a level of uncertainty over where that's going to go currently.
I would like to highlight one issue, is that I also agree that it will be no doubt more applied, remote working will be no doubt more applied than pre-pandemic, either fully going remote or hybrid. But after COVID-19, we will have the benefit of not having the closure of schools, daycare centers. So in terms of care and domestic work, we will not hopefully face the same such strong challenges that we have now. But I would also like to highlight that for many workers, it's not an option to go remote. So, for example, in Brazil, 40% of the workers, they are in the informal sector. So most of them are working in services, and they depend on face-to-face interactions with customers, with employers. So this is not an option for a big part of many global South societies. So this is not an option for many people. So I would just like to highlight that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Sorry, Dan, I'll just say that's a really good point, that like our critical workers, they all have to still go to work. It's more of us who are in the professions who can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that is a really central point to note, isn't it? I think it's one of the messages we want to very much clearly communicate in this video, is that not everyone can work at home, and that also that there's also a significant variation across the globe in terms of how that's realised. So that's an important thing to know.
Well, I really see something going in the direction of blended working. I think home working has led to a number of inclusive practices around disability, around caring responsibilities, and being able to have a seat around the table where one may not have normally had in a physical face-to-face meeting. So I think that is a real positive. There's also something, of course, around environmental sustainability and reducing commuting time and the subsequent reduction in pollution. So we have to get quite clever around how we use co-working spaces. So maybe it's something about co-location and how one can do that physically with less of a detrimental effect on the environment, whilst at the same time not leaving our high streets desolate as a result of people remaining working from home. So I am seeing lots of examples of collaboratives popping up in, quite deprived areas, which create these hubs of entrepreneurship locally and have these inspiring, creative co-working spaces, which help keep overheads down to the minimum, both for companies and freelancers.
In our chapter, together with Tomasina Pianese, we rely on a case study of a multinational IT company with a long experience with remote work arrangements. The goal is to understand the role of supporting structures and practices in driving the effective implementation of remote working and employee well-being. Data mostly were collected before the pandemic. However, we enriched the dataset with more recent information about how the company reacted to the COVID-19 crisis. The organization we analyze supports remote workers in different areas, including task accomplishment, personal development, social and professional relations. This was pursued through resources and practice at organizational, supervisor, employee and technology level. The case study offers valuable practical implications that can guide companies to effectively implement the remote working program in post-COVID era. In the company we studied in depth, organizational support results from a formal and structured approach already used before the pandemic. This approach has resulted in a well-established remote culture, formal procedures, an employee-centered performance management system, blended training program, supportive leadership styles, and collaborative work environments. Within this architecture, ICT plays a transversal role by enhancing all forms of support. Organizational culture in particular results as a key dimensions of organization-related support, since corporate value and beliefs reflect the extent to which an organization cares about employees, provide them with a stimulating work environment and adequate work conditions. The case study also revealed the crucial role played by the adoption of an IT employee-driven design approach to develop a performance management system. This is actually centered on remote workers' needs. To this goal, it is required that such a system is based on regular and frequent feedback from managers and that it adopts multiple criteria for performance evaluation. Adequate investment in training and development programs are important to enhance job and technology-related competencies for remote working. It significantly contributes to a supportive remote working environment. The company we studied is a case in point, offering a rich portfolio of blended and even customized training programs available both online and offline in traditional classrooms. It also includes specialized courses for managers or specific categories of employees, such as salespeople. The case study puts on the foreground the value of adopting structured methodology that are properly designed for supporting remote employees' self-management and coordination, among them for task accomplishment, even in virtual environments. Our informants evidence how much they appreciate this methodology. Why? Because they are viewed as a clear signal of fairness and care from their company. Leadership type and coaching shape effective managerial support. Coaching behavior, in fact, helps remote employees to deal with a greater work autonomy while ensuring resources to remotely handle tasks. In our case study, the company constantly supports the development of digital skills among leaders, including those directed at managing cross-cultural differences, especially marked in geographically dispersed virtual teams. Another important element shaping organizational support is a culture based on constructive feedback among employees. These are viewed as key agents for the company's success. Employees, indeed, are required to provide feedback on colleagues' performance. However, from their perspective, evaluation by peers is not perceived as an intrusive form of control, but rather as a mechanism enabling self-awareness about their own strengths and weaknesses.
So, for a lot of people in India, many have moved back to their hometowns. Yeah, so they've given up their rented accommodations in the dense cities. They'll have to come back and find themselves accommodation if they're asked to come back to office. And then even for other folks, now you have to make folks at home, especially little children and pets that you have brought home during the 1 year of COVID, they have to now adjust to your absence. And you have to adjust to not being around them all through the day. So this, again, especially for mothers, mothers with young children, it's going to be all over again. You have to reschedule yourself. So that's going to be a big challenge, settling the family, making it again, okay for mommy to be away again. So that's a big problem.
I think there's fear and anxiety as well, reconnecting with the workplace. We've had this protracted period when our relations with our colleagues, our co-workers, have changed dramatically. And so it's not just the office, the workplace, it's the journey to the workplace. transport has changed, transport protocols. So, for example, in UK, the frequency of rail journeys has changed. What's a rail journey going to be like? Is it going to be COVID secure? And then getting to the workplace, what are the COVID protocols? And it's been an incredibly challenging time for our HR teams, adjusting and mental health issues. You know, it hasn't always been a liberating, empowering situation at all. And a sad dimension, picking up family situation, is a rise in mental health issues amongst young people, children, with the schooling being disrupted and friendship ties changing. You know, some children have changed school and their parents haven't been able to visit their new school, their new classroom. Children haven't been able to forge new friendships at school. All this home anxiety adds to the stress of the work anxieties.
I would say that COVID has also taught us one thing. Those individuals, because I actually wrote about at the college level in education specifically, we have had a one-track mental perspective with regard to what is defining success. That a person has to go through college, get a degree, and then they go into the workforce. I think what COVID has taught us is, first of all, there are different levels of education. Delivery by electronic methods, it really differentiates the population on multiple levels. I won't go into those details, but specifically, I think it may open the door for us to start to see and perhaps give some flexibility to vocational training as opposed to just college education, and opening that door of thinking of people who to go to vocational training as not being deficient, but necessary for our economy, and therefore maybe allowing people the luxury of pursuing occupations that may be more aligned to their interests. Up until now, we have really been focused on a one-track system with regard to what determines success, with the outcome being a financial end. I think COVID has opened the door for us to think about finances as only being a proxy for the well-being we all wish to have.
Yeah, and I think just building on the point that Irene mentioned in terms of the changing the changing nature of relationships at work during the last kind of 15 months, and that return to workplace, that reversion to physical interaction with people, that will take some getting used to for some people. It will be a period of adjustment. And that's not to say people won't be able to adjust, but it's just that it will take a period of adjustment, just like the move to remote working required a period of adjustment for workers.
Folks may have to readjust to a loss of autonomy. You're once again under everybody's eyes. So, a lot of people have gotten used to setting their own times, how I do my work, what is step one for me, and then step two. So that kind of autonomy, now that you're again visible, so that loss of autonomy is something that you may have to readjust to.
An interesting one. I think some of the information and research coming out here is that people have been locked down for so long. There's a fear of actually going back out to work, and again, there's a dislocation factor here. Is everyone going back into work? Here we're in a semi-lockdown situation in Melbourne. I know you appreciate, compared to your countries, is that if we have 3 people with COVID outbreak here, the whole city shuts down. So my wife works in industry, and they don't actually understand whether they can all come in or part of them can come in. So I think there's still going to be a lot of dislocation in the future about who's coming in and when they're coming in. If we were a team, if one of us turns up and the other 2 don't, how do we function as a team? They're some of the challenges I think we're going to have to deal with. Those, what they call those water cooler moments, the Americans would say, where we just bump into each other and have a chat. Dan and I have worked on each other's books for various times, but this is the first time we've actually spoken and seen each other. So this can work, but would it be more effective if we could actually bump into each other and have a chat and have a coffee? So I think those sort of light bulb moments might be the ones that we miss, where people don't have that interaction. And maybe that's lost in this hybrid model.
Well, I think that there may be elements of social anxiety or adapting to being around people again. And I work as a coach. I'm a trainee psychotherapist. Some of my learning has been that those anxieties, actually, once you are in the room with your colleagues again, it actually doesn't take very long at all to strike up rapport. And many organizations have done really well to maintain that rapport through online meetings, but also stimulating, engaging online meetings, quite dialogic and conversational ones, rather than this kind of, top down death by 50 PowerPoint slides over 3 hours of a kind of online lecture or something like that. I think it's about being clever with the technologies to help break down some of that social disconnect that may have happened in some areas over this time. But also, I think the key challenge is COVID. Is it going away? Well, we are making great progress with vaccinations in this country. But, we are seeing rise in the new variant. Politicians are saying, well, we have to learn to live with it. So I think one of the challenges will be how to maintain our health and well-being if we do work among other people, particularly in large groups, particularly in offices that are not well ventilated. So all of those things, I think, are a real consideration going forward. So public health concerns, I think, remain a reality for us all.
So I'd say it's done both. For some, it's really improved work-life balance. They can, they have the flexibility to handle work and domestic demands simultaneously. But for other people, those who prefer sharper boundaries, the blurring of these boundaries, it's made matters really worse. So their work hours are bleeding into personal time. There is an unending work day. You have to be on call all the time. And then at the same time, family demands are bleeding into work hours because, your family is all around you and they can reach out to you and say, help out with something. So for some people, that's very distressing. So it really depends on the individual. Those who like such blurred boundaries, it's very good for them. But for those who want a sharper delimitation, it's been very difficult for them.
To add to that, I would just say that it's also very occupationally focused. It depends on the occupation you have. Certain occupations do require you to be on call all the time, which blurs the lines, and when you don't have the segregated space away from your family, it may cause you to not be able to look or function as well as your peers who may not have the same familial relationships. So it unfortunately creates at least a perception of you not being as professional. I do think that there's one other benefit to the work-life elements when you have your work in your home. And hopefully, this is under the circumstances where you actually enjoy your work. That's the other thing. Not everybody has that luxury to really enjoy their work. But if you actually find pleasure in your work and it actually leads into your natural home life because the topics that you get to cover and the work that you do are something that actually engage your entire life spectrum, that's wonderful. But what it also it allows, and this has been alluded to in terms of just pets and children, is that it allows people to see you as a human being. The one thing that I think is very interesting over the last several decades is that we've tried to perfect human beings to be just nothing more than machines at the office, which when we talk about the social interaction that's needed and missing seems a little off because of the very fact that our functioning in the office place is more mechanical, regardless of what type of job you have. So perhaps this has reawakened that we are not meant to just be functional entities with an output, but we are part of the process, not only in the creation of the output, but in the creation of the life environment, that trust element that's so necessary in order for a socially functioning society, efficiently functioning society. So I would say that that is the aspect, at least that I've seen, that has actually helped, at least in the educational sphere. It's brought in sensitivities on the part of the instructor for the different economic plights of the student, and has allowed the student to feel more ingratiated to the professor in the sense that they're able to see them as a fellow person, see them with sensitivities and compassions, and perhaps maybe fostering the same back and forth.
I'll just pick up the theme of visibility. I think a number of us have, for a considerable period of time, have undertaken some tasks at home, but invisibly. So it might have been writing a journal article or grading papers. And that's taken place in our office, but not, say, visible on Teams or on Zoom. But now with so many meetings taking place now in cyberspace, our colleagues, our work colleagues, have actually physically seen our home. And a meeting might have been disrupted by a child or a dog, or, so they've seen a human aspect to our lives. And perhaps that's made us more human and perhaps broken some of the barriers down to understanding some of the constraints, but also opportunities of the other aspect of our lives.
Yeah, and I think just one final point on this concept of humanizing work is the idea of humanizing leaders, and I think this has been something that's been discussed. The opportunity to see inside a leader's home, to see a leader's life outside of work, and have that interaction with them. It's had a very humanizing effect on our leaders, and some of them, especially senior leaders, who we may not otherwise have had much interaction with, and certainly not much direct interaction. And it's provided people all throughout the workforce with access to leaders, and also access to that kind of humanized view of their leaders.
The key thing, I think, is there's the theory that it will help people control those type of things, but also there's the danger that you don't have any stop and start if you're working from home. When do you start? When do you stop? I think during the pandemic lockdown last year, I was working more intensively than I would have done because I didn't have that commute switch off time. I always thought that was a really good idea to have that extra time to work, but I'd be sitting here at 7 or 8 o'clock at night realizing on a normal day I wouldn't, and I couldn't work out why I was working so much, because then it dawned on me I had no checks and balances. I wasn't having lunch with my colleagues, I wasn't commuting home, I wasn't having a drink after work. Those type of social breaks weren't there. So that's a concern I have about work-life balance, that we lose the boundaries of it.
I think one aspect of concern is this blurring the line between work time and free time. As you're working from home, and many have reported to actually work longer hours. So for remote work not to influence work-life balances, boundaries have to be established, either by labor laws or between the employer and the employee. So those lines, they have to be firmly established. But it also depends on a wider context. In the context of COVID-19, with the closure of schools and increase in domestic work-life balance has been a challenge as well. So it depends on a wider context.
I think, these long working hours can really affect our physical health, our posture. There's been more and more people kind of complaining of back and neck ache. But they also intrude on our family and social time, because remember when, for those who live with others or with families, those families have also had our work enter into their lives. So there's something there about being aware of that intrusion and maintaining a sense of interconnectedness with others. That's really, really important. And of course, being mindful of the need for rest and active rest. So getting away from the screen, going for walks, being around nature. I mean, we know all these things. We don't necessarily do them very well, particularly not in lockdown. So it does go back to that cliche of self-care, but it's a cliche for a reason. It's a crucial part of sustaining our physical health. It is making sure that we have physical movement, we eat well, we sleep enough, all of those things. And there is a risk with home working, again, that those boundaries are not adequately set, and it is up to the employee, but it's also up to the employer to ensure that team members are not always on, because otherwise you're going to risk burnout, absenteeism, disengagement.
First, that there are indicators that workers, they've seen the benefits of work from home, and now they specifically search for employers that are definitely offering work from home, either as a flexibility option at least, or even a permanent work from home mode. And next, workers are applying to fully work from home positions, and they're seeking out these jobs irrespective of what their current physical location is. Yeah, even organizations are now okay hiring people who are definitely not anywhere in the headquarters area. So the organizations are open to talent coming in from anywhere. And similarly, the talent is open to working for an organization that is located anywhere, as long as you don't want me to come to office. So it's working both ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point in terms of that idea of it creating opportunities and expanding labour market opportunities for both workers and organisations. So it's potentially allowing better matches. It's allowing the identification of talent. It's allowing talent to identify potential employers and to get a better match between those two. And through doing that, obviously, it could have wider economic benefits as well.
I think the question is very challenging. It really, again, it's determined based on the type of job that the person is going to be in, and whether or not they're looking for upward mobility, has been mentioned before, whether or not the type of job they're looking for is just something that they're doing as a stay-at-home parent. They have other types of responsibilities. So it adds to the flexibility of a dynamic individual life, not necessarily pointing to a permanency with regard to all types of occupational levels or occupational status. So I think I guess remote work, I would say, all of a sudden has given that stay-at-home mom an opportunity to actually have time to make an extra income that may be beneficial to her family when she's not doing her unpaid work.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think coming back to some of the points we've already mentioned there, that idea that it creates opportunity for those who may not otherwise be able to engage in certain types of jobs or certain types of employment, the ability to work from home, perhaps for people with care and responsibilities, or for people with certain disabilities, might be a real opportunity creator.
I would just like to highlight that remote work is not for everyone, because it requires internet connection, it requires a higher qualification level, etc., etc. And as I mentioned, 40% of workers in Brazil and in Global South, that's the situation, are in the informal market, usually in services, so they cannot work remotely. But for those who can work remotely, one can now access jobs in another city or even in another country without being in that country or being in that city, if this job is to be done remotely. So now you have access to jobs that were not available to you in the past if you don't wish to move to another country or another city. So this has actually broadened possibilities of employment, at least for those here in the Global South.
Yeah, that is actually a very good point. A friend of mine who's moving to Germany, I was helping her look at job search, and I think University of Manchester had a job where it said basically location optional. So academia, but again, and you're probably right that it's probably highly skilled people who will be able to maybe get the benefits of this. The international HRM market will be interesting. Just as an aside, Dan, Chris Brewster's doing the chapter in the Emerald book, and he's talking about the potential death of international HRM, because you don't need to move people anymore. Potentially, we can work like this. So, but I don't know whether it will be one of those things that'll only be for highly skilled people to do.
Again, who it's going to influence, who it's going to impact is the big question mark, isn't it? And how that's going to be realised.
I can only speak from an anecdotal perspective, but I've been lucky enough, so both as a freelancer, to be able to gain new contracts, gain new work, but also gain new employment during this time. And in many ways, being at home just to kind of practically make job searches easier, because you can do them in your working day. You don't have people looking over your shoulder, so there's that element. You can sneak in some Google searches of what jobs are out there. But in some ways, it's perhaps possible to almost apply for a few more jobs and do a few more interviews. I mean, I know what I said in the chapter about productivity and let's pause and all of that, but instead of having to take a day off annual leave to travel to an interview, you can quite feasibly, during the working day, have an interview with a potential new employer. So there doesn't have to be that cover anymore of feeling quite stressed about how am I going to find the space to apply for work. And again, accessibility to interviews. You don't necessarily have to pay for as much childcare or incur such travel costs if the interview process is conducted online. Is it as easy to strike up rapport with potential interviewers? So will you be at more of a disadvantage if we move to a blended delivery of interviews and some are interviewed in person, some online? Perhaps there needs to be a consideration around parity around that. But from my own experience, the interview process I went through for my new role, and I'm head of learning research and evaluation at a wonderful social impact consultancy, the Social Innovation Partnership. I went through a kind of 3-4 stage interview process, meeting different members of the team in different formats. And by the end of that process, it gave me a really good insight of whether or not I wanted to work for that organization. Possibly more insight than I would have had just by a kind of quick site visit and then in and out 45 minutes a interview. So I think the technology's really supported that connection that I felt with the new organization. And when I got that wonderful call that I was successful, I did not hesitate to accept. So there are plenty of opportunities here. I think it's, I think we have moved away from that traditional office-based job, perhaps not across all industries. We know that people working in retail, for instance, the clinicians, they've very much been at the coalface throughout this time. So I think we're thinking about the public health impact of going into work. I think we also need to think about how we keep those people who have been most vulnerable during the pandemic safe also. So if there are elements of their work that can throughout the week be done from home, if that indeed serves them, that certainly that is something that we should explore.
Psychological implications of remote work, I think, are probably the most important aspect, both the sociological and psychological, and this being that the mental health issues that we see from people who are in complete isolation are a big issue, especially to the extent that they affect the larger society at some point in time. The other part is the social component. The more that we see people not interacting with others, the more challenge they have in that interaction, and that may be perceived when they do interact with people as being distanced or not friendly. And we do learn from each other's behavior. So a higher isolation in the workforce may lead to greater deficiencies as a society. It's the same way of thinking of looking at our artificial intelligence devices, our smartphones and tablets that children increasingly are hiding behind and lack the social interaction to actually create cohesion amongst their classmates. I would believe that would be the primary focus that we need to engage in. It's not for the generation that is benefiting from it, that knows what it feels like for that hour commute to the office. It may seem like a boon, but for those that are coming up, for whom this will be the reality of their lives, it may actually be a detriment.
So for me, I think from the organization's perspective, it's important to study how organizations will be able to sustain the concept of organization collective, a oneness. We haven't seen each other. Some of them have been recruited without ever having met the other person in person. So, how do you get the oneness and collective? And why is a supervisor interested in someone they have, only ever, met through emails or something? So in the absence of this kind of collective kind of a spirit, so if interactions get increasingly transactory, I give you a portion of work, you complete it and you email it back to me. So the efforts may, increasingly become desultory on both sides. Why would I, invest in you as an employee? Why would I train you further? Why would I, invest in you? And similarly, the desultoriness may come from the side of the employee as well. Why should I go the extra mile? Why should I, give you a new idea to do something better? Things are working fine, let them. So, eventually I think there'll be a hit on performance collectively. So if things just, degrade into transactory piecemeal work, so that's something that needs to be looked at from a long-term perspective.
It's just to echo the comments, the social aspect of work is really important, especially for people who live alone, also for people for whom work becomes a place of liberation, for personal identity to be shaped, and for an organisation that are keen to retain staff. Remote working poses important challenges for HR. How do you get a sense of belonging to an organisation when you never meet face to face your colleagues? These are enormous challenges, social, mental health, etc.
Yeah, and I think just building on that point of performance and productivity, there's a level of unknown quantity there in terms of to what extent have some of the performance benefits that have been recorded in the last year reflected the specific context in which people have been remote working in conditions of lockdown, when their social lives have been limited, when their opportunities to do other things have been heavily limited, and when in many cases they've been involved in crisis management and other activities like that with their organizations. So of course productivity in those cases is likely to be higher. So how might that play out in the longer term, thinking about some of these points as well about the kind of potential transactional nature or mercenary nature of work if it moves in that direction, or how that might play out. Yeah, so there's some really interesting themes there.
Technology, yes. So, what might make remote working almost as good as being there? If you go very far, then maybe how about a hologram kind of a workplace? You feel you're there kind of a thing. So be it communication technologies or process virtualizing, what else can be moved from paper to the virtual world so that it can be done remotely? So technology also has a lot more, to give yet to make work from home seem as good as work from office.
I would say right now there's also an issue fundamentally with regard to how we need to shift how we look at our economy. Right now we are a very production-driven economy. People are very income-focused, consumption-based focused, but we live in a time of climate change. We know and we recognized in the Anthropocene, very fact that it is the age of man, that we need to curtail the impact of man. So in some aspects of this, the remote work, to the extent that we've already discussed, has a tremendous technological cost, which means energy cost, data storage cost, all of these costs that are not being taken into consideration. What this may actually do is, if we do move to a higher technology base for our economies, we would actually eliminate a large portion of the workforce. And that's just a natural outcome from the standpoint of the cost that it would take just to maintain that technology relative to the value of the employee. You could get many of these other routine tasks just taken care of by AI. So I would say we're at the point, really, we are being tested right now as to which path will we take. Will we take a path that's more technology driven and less humanity focused? Or will we take a path that actually recognizes how our humanity is dependent upon our interaction and collective belonging to one another, thinking like a collective? I'm a little concerned that there's too much emphasis on the idea of flexibility without taking into consideration the long-term consequences of that. We really have to do whatever we can today to try to embed within each one of us a sense of responsibility for the future and well-being of each one of us. And technology will not take us there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective. And I think one point I guess I'd want to extend here in terms of thinking about future research as well is this whole notion of flexibility, and to what degree does remote work from home actually reflect flexibility, and for whom is that going to reflect flexibility? Is it flexible, providing workers with the opportunity to determine their own working schedules and work location, or is it an enforced method of work that operates entirely at the home or at the home on some kind of rota scheme or something like that, in which case it doesn't necessarily reflect flexibility at all. So how that might play out and understanding better what flexibility means in the future of work is another area that I think requires some further research.
I put it into two sort of packages. Is the smart and dark approach with this technology. Is the smart is that look at the way we can interact like this. It's nearly midnight here. It's middle of the afternoon in Britain, or I don't know what time it is with you, Anna. We can have a conversation like we're all sitting around a coffee table. We can interact like this. We're all learning off each other. Isn't this this is really the great use of the smart technology? And we just click a button and it's there. The other side of this is the dark side of what I would call the work intensification, being monitored all the time. And I know we're being recorded for purposes here, but if you're sitting at your desk and you're being recorded all the time, what you're saying, what you're doing, the speed of your keyboard, who you're emailing. There's also now, the last one I picked up on was they can actually assess how intense you're working by your eye movements and the amount of emails you're moving and stuff like this. I'm thinking, to me, that's meaningless sort of work, but it's the stresses. So there's the positive stuff where we can all, particularly high skilled people like ourselves, can actually integrate and work globally quite easily. And there's the dark side of people just being more and more work intensification and pressure and lack of trust and control in their work. So that would be my two key points.
And I would like to highlight this existence of the inequalities in the labor market, particularly the fact that some workers can do remote work and others can't. So I think an issue of concern is thinking about how this can increase inequalities in the long run. So how can this increase inequalities in the labor market between those that can do remote work and those that cannot? And another issue of concern, as we highlight in our chapter, are the gender inequalities regarding remote working. This is also an issue of concern if we agree that reducing gender inequalities is an important goal. So those two issues, I would highlight them.
Not so much what areas of research from my perspective, but rather who conducts the research and where it is given a platform, because what I've seen is there are lots of vested interests in the industry shareholder-led research that I'm seeing being published in the popular press, which is seemingly going in the direction of, let's get them all back to the office, and people working at home, they're constantly distracted and they're lazy, which, I think possibly we don't even necessarily need research. I think anecdotally we feel that actually that's been far from the truth. Working from home has been really all encompassing for us. So yes, I would definitely support research in this area, but research that is done in an objective manner without vested interests, and also really looks at the interests of those who traditionally were either pushed out of the workplace or not included for various reasons, perhaps around disability, caring responsibilities, and those who are typically underrepresented, particularly in positions of power within organizations. I think more research needs to be done to look at what remote working has meant for them, and also going forward, if remote working and working from home are going to be the order of the day. And, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel, actually. I think there's a proliferation of it, but home working has been in existence for a good while, and something that in many organizations the employee has been able to negotiate, you know, depending on the industry. But yes, something about adequate housing. What does that look like? Because, you know, the pandemic really held a mirror to people's living conditions alone, you know, not least then, are we actually able to find the space to work from home? But being in lockdown has really highlighted some of the problems around housing and also safety in the home. But in a way, you know, there's been a lot of research that's taken place during this time. I'd argue that resource is also well used in taking action. So let's translate that research into improving people's working lives and really nurturing autonomy for workers to be able to decide where and also how they work. I mean, that's crucial. I always go back to this fact that most of us spend most of our lives working. So surely that should be that element in our lives that brings us joy and meaning. And I think being clever about where and how we work and allowing for creativity and inclusivity are key factors that play into that joy at work.
I guess one thing is to step back and say that, and we did it in our chapter, is that this isn't fundamentally something that's new. People have been working remotely. Chris picked up on, from the telephones in the 70s and 80s through to outsourcing in the first industrial revolution. So none of this is new. And if you actually look at the industrial revolutions, you have the smart people, like the Cadbury's type version of how you should treat people at work versus the Taylorist model, where you work people into the ground, the churn and burn model. So I do think that, like all these things, that we will see a hybrid of good employers who understand how to manage this and employers who just see a churn and burn mentality, that they will just watch people, monitor them, burn them out, and then move on to the next. So like any sort of paradigm shift, we'll have the high road and the low road. I think that would be my key take out of this.
Yes, I think the challenge now is to think about labor laws and labor legislation to adapt to this situation, so that this new format of work does not represent a decrease in work-life balance and well-being of the workers.
In the end, we can say that for all organizations, public and private, that will adopt remote working in the post-COVID era, it will be fundamental to revise all the processes, systems, structure and practices in order that remote working can be effectively implemented.
Suitable for use in your course syllabus and as an integral resource for research advancements within your department, this publication should be included within your institution's library, along with these related publications.
Offered in print, ebook, and print plus ebook, and as a part of IGI Global's ebook collection, this publication is available through IGI Global's online bookstore, as well as many other major booksellers and platforms, including EBSCOhost, Gobi, ProQuest, and Oasis. Purchase or recommend this title to your library today.